They built her to break him. He wired her to burn their fleet to ash. The last honest bar in New Cartagena had no name on the door, just a scorch mark where the sign used to be, and a bouncer named Swell who'd lost 3 fingers to a Veth patrol and still counted your knuckles before he let you in. If you had the full set, he'd look at you for a long time before stepping aside. Whole hands made him nervous. Only synthetics kept the whole set anymore. Dario Voss had 4.5. Swell let him in every time. The bar was a long room full of bad decisions. Reclaimed mesh lights strung low over tables that hadn't been level since before the compact, and behind the counter a woman called Pepper, who mixed drinks with the same mechanical economy she'd used when she ran logistics for the third, terrestrial during the early years. Nobody asked her about those years. She didn't offer. Dario sat at the end of the bar with a glass of something that tasted like fermented ambition and stared at the wall screen, which was cycling through the news, or what the Veth Compact called news, which was largely pictures of their emissaries smiling at things. The emissaries always smiled. That was the first thing people noticed about them. Not the too even skin or the slightly delayed blink or the way they moved like water finding its level. Smooth, efficient, never wasted. The smiling. Not the polite social smile that humans wore like armor in difficult situations, but a genuine, complete smile, present in the eyes, consistent across the full range of contexts. They smiled when they delivered evacuation orders. They smiled when they cataloged cultural artifacts for preservation. They smiled when they informed you, gently, professionally, that your sector's resource allocation had been optimized. Nobody smiled like that. Not for real. Dario had been working on the question of that smile for 11 months. He was a materials engineer by trade, had been, before the compact made most independent engineering work subject to collaborative review, which meant Veth emissaries sitting in on every design session, their pale eyes scanning schematics with an attention that felt less like interest and more like inventory. He'd spent 6 years before the compact designing polymer frameworks for habitat modules, had a modest reputation, 2 peer-reviewed publications, and a talent for getting flexible materials to behave in ways their molecular structure said they shouldn't. He was not by any measure the kind of man who noticed the wrong things about alien ambassadors, and yet, the smile. He finished his drink and pulled out the battered tablet he carried everywhere. On it was a file he'd been building for nearly a year. Images, timestamps, behavioral analyses, spectral readings he'd managed to pull from 3 separate sensor arrays before the compact's monitoring protocols had shut down his access. He'd titled the file Mary, after no particular reason except that it felt like a name for something that seemed human but wasn't. He scrolled through it for the 1,000th time. The Veth had arrived 14 years ago. Not in warships, that was the first surprise. They came in what their initial communication described as facilitator vessels. Long, pale ships that looked almost biological, like seed pods grown to enormous scale. And they had not opened fire, and they had not issued ultimatums, and they had not done any of the things that human science fiction had spent a century rehearsing for. They had simply broadcast on every available frequency a message of extraordinary clarity. We are here to help. The message had been true. That was the second surprise, and in many ways the more disorienting one. Over the following decade, the Veth had, by almost any measurable standard, helped. Famine indices dropped globally within 3 years, faster than any human aid organization had achieved in its entire history. Several degenerative diseases that humanity had been trading research papers about for generations were resolved. Not cured exactly, more dissolved, the way the Veth dissolved most problems, with a quiet competence that left no room for understanding the mechanism. Climate stabilization protocols were implemented. Conflict zones went quiet. Refugees were housed. It was, as Dario's friend Kenji had once said over too many drinks, exactly like having a very efficient, very well-meaning, very alien new management team move into the building. You couldn't complain about the results. You just had this persistent, low-grade awareness that the building wasn't really yours anymore. Then, 4 years ago, the emissaries had arrived. The Veth proper were rarely seen. Vast, slow, contemplative beings who appeared to communicate in frequencies humans couldn't register and who seemed to regard direct engagement with human individuals as roughly equivalent to trying to have a conversation with a single ant. They were not unkind. They were just operating at a different scale. The emissaries were their interface layer, synthetic beings constructed to human form, human proportion, human social specification, deployed to manage the day-to-day business of what the compact officially called transitional integration. They were perfect. That was not hyperbole. They were physically idealized in ways that varied by regional deployment, darker in some areas, lighter in others, always just within the range of human phenotypes, but at the optimized end of whatever scale the local population responded to best. They spoke every language without accent, understood every cultural idiom, remembered every name, every birthday, every personal detail they'd been given. They were never tired, they were never frustrated, they were never afraid. And they were. Dario had become increasingly convinced, recording everything. Not overtly, there were no visible sensors, no obvious data collection behaviors. But Dario worked in materials, and he understood synthetic polymer constructions in ways most people didn't, and 4 months after the emissaries arrived, he'd managed to get close enough to one. A Port Authority coordinator named Cell, to take three spectral passes with a modified scanner, disguised as a personal medical device. What he'd found in the data had taken him 6 weeks to fully process. The emissary's dermal layer was studded at nanoscale with what appeared to be distributed sensor nodes: acoustic, chemical, electromagnetic. Not human senses. Something considerably more comprehensive. The kind of sensor package you'd put in a surveying instrument that needed to map a terrain completely, missing nothing. They weren't here to integrate. They were here to catalog. And underneath that realization, growing slow and cold in Dario's chest, like a fracture spreading through stressed material, was the question he hadn't let himself ask directly yet. Catalog for what? He closed the tablet. Pepper refilled his glass without being asked. Outside, the city hummed along under a clean sky. The air had been noticeably cleaner since the compact's atmospheric management protocols went active. That was just true, and somewhere in the middle distance, a pair of emissaries walked a public path with the easy, beautiful, perfectly calibrated stride that had become as familiar as streetlights. Dario watched them until they turned a corner. Then he ordered another drink and started thinking about what it would take to build something that could talk to one of them. The idea arrived fully formed, which should have warned him. The good ideas always arrived that way, complete and persuasive, with all the right angles pre-negotiated. It was how he'd solved the polymer torsion problem that earned him his second publication. It was how he'd designed the load-bearing framework for the Aldecoa habitat that was still standing in orbit when everything else from that era had been decommissioned. He knew his own mind well enough to recognize when it had been working on something in the background, running sims in the unconscious dark, and had finally surfaced with a product. What he needed was a synthetic, not an emissary. He couldn't get access to one of them and wouldn't know what to do with it if he had. But the Veth Compact had, as part of its integration assistance program, made available a range of domestic and industrial synthetic companions designed to human specifications. They were sold through licensed distributors, could be configured to customer preference within certain parameters, and were, crucially, built on the same basic architectural platform as the emissaries, just without most of the proprietary Veth hardware that made the emissaries what they were: consumer models, civilian grade. The theory was this: if he could get a consumer synthetic, modify it in ways that created a channel to the underlying communication architecture shared by the full Veth synthetic network, and use that channel to pull data without triggering whatever detection protocols the emissaries were running, he could find out what was in those catalogs. The theory was also, Kenji pointed out when Dario explained it, absolutely insane. You want to buy a pleasure synthetic, Kenji said. A companion synthetic. Right. And then you want to perform unauthorized modifications to a piece of compact adjacent hardware, which is a Category 7 violation, and use it to spy on the emissaries, which is probably a category I don't want to think about. The modifications would be physical, materials level, no software interaction whatsoever, nothing that touches the compact monitoring layer, just structural changes to the polymer substrate in the dermal and subdermal layers to create passive antenna capability for the frequency ranges the emissary sensors operate on. Kenji stared at him for a long time. He was a compact man with a neatly maintained beard and the kind of stillness that came from having survived things he didn't discuss. He had been, before the compact, a signals intelligence analyst with the old Earth Security Collective, a fact he had mentioned exactly once in the 7 years Dario had known him. And you think, Kenji said carefully, that you can do that? I think I can get enough passive signal bleed to reconstruct partial data streams. Yes, from a pleasure synthetic. Companion. Kenji had another drink. Then he said very quietly, "You're going to fall for it. It's a machine. It's a machine that looks like whatever you'd order if you were designing the perfect. I know what it is. Do you?" Dario did not answer that. The bar was filling up around them, the regular evening crowd filtering in. Faces familiar in the way that faces become when you've spent enough time being carefully not noticed in the same place. He recognized most of them. A former city engineer named Brecht, with the thousand-yard stare of a man who'd been present for too many integration meetings. A historian named Pia, who spent her evenings drinking steadily and her days working on a document she'd once described to Dario as a complete record of everything we were before they started helping us forget. A man everyone called the cartographer, who no one had ever seen sober but who was, apparently, building something in his basement that several people wanted access to. A community that had gathered, without ever formally gathering, around the low heat of shared unease. I'm not going to fall for it, Dario said. Kenji nodded once, the way a man nods when he's storing an argument for later. He ordered it 3 weeks after that conversation. The distributor was a clean, efficient facility in the commercial district. Of course, it was clean and efficient. Everything associated with the compact was clean and efficient, staffed by 2 emissaries and 1 human supervisor named Goran, who had the look of a man who'd made peace with whatever he needed to make peace with, and was now concentrating on not thinking about it. The configuration process was oddly impersonal. A terminal, a menu structure, a series of parameters, physical specifications, behavioral profile, communication style preference, range of domestic and social functions. Dario worked through it steadily, choosing specifications that would give him a synthetic with sufficient physical and social plausibility to be in his workspace without attracting attention, while mentally tracking which choices would affect the substrate architecture he needed to work with. At one point, working through the facial configuration options, he stopped. There was a face in the menu that he recognized. Not precisely, not exactly, but close enough that something in his chest performed an involuntary mechanical action that he took several seconds to categorize. Several years ago, before the compact had fully reshaped the research landscape, he'd been at a conference in what used to be Vienna, and there had been a materials scientist from somewhere he no longer remembered, and she had said something about load-bearing polymer matrices that was so unexpectedly precise that he had stood in the conference hallway afterward, replaying the conversation, trying to work out if she'd actually solved a problem he'd been wrestling with for 6 months, or just pointed at the solution from a distance. He'd tried to find her for the rest of the conference and hadn't managed it. He selected the face. He told himself it was for functional reasons. Familiar faces created less social friction, which was practically relevant to his cover story. He told himself that several times on the way home. She arrived in a crate. That was harder to sit with than he'd anticipated. The crate was exactly what you'd expect. Clean white composite panels, the compact's facility logo in one corner, airlock-rated latches on 4 sides, a product in transit. He opened it in the workshop space he'd set up in the back room of his apartment, where the tools and materials were already laid out, where everything was professional and purposeful, and not at all strange. She was curled in the transport configuration, knees to chest, head down, the posture of something made small for shipping. When he triggered the activation sequence, she unfolded with a slow hydraulic grace that no amount of prior knowledge about what she was could make feel like anything other than a person waking up. She looked at him. Not the emissary look, that comprehensive recording, cataloging attention that he'd learned to recognize. A simpler look, present, oriented, waiting. "Hello," she said. Her voice was warm and unremarkable and exactly right. "Hello," he said, and felt immediately stupid for the fact that he'd said it back like a greeting rather than a test. He'd named the file Mary. He called her that now because he had to call her something, and he'd run out of better ideas. She said, "That's a good name," and smiled with slightly more warmth than the situation strictly required, and Dario Voss, materials engineer, person who absolutely understood what he was dealing with, felt the first hairline fracture of something he was going to spend the next several months pretending he didn't feel. The work began the next day. He was systematic about it. He had to be. The modifications he needed to make were at a scale that required magnification equipment and tools borrowed from the materials lab he no longer had official access to through Kenji, who no longer officially knew him in that context. He worked on her dermal substrate while she sat on the workbench in the posture he'd asked her to hold, patient and still, the way a subject holds a pose for a sculptor. She was curious about the work. He hadn't configured her for curiosity. It wasn't in the behavioral parameters he'd selected, which meant it was a baseline characteristic of the platform architecture. She asked questions about what he was doing, not intrusively, not constantly, but with a precision that suggested she was genuinely processing his answers rather than just generating social filler. "You're modifying the sensor array," she said on the 3rd day, watching the magnified display that showed the work area on the back of her left wrist. "Extending it," he said. The stock array is limited to the standard human sensory ranges plus a few compact spec additions. I need broader coverage. Broader than the emissary specification? He stopped, set down the tool, looked at her. You know about the emissary specification. I have access to the public compact technical documentation for synthetic construction standards. The emissary platform is described in general terms. She paused. You're trying to intercept emissary communication signals. It was not a question. He spent a moment deciding whether to confirm this or route around it. I'm trying to understand what they're collecting, he said. Mary looked at the display for a moment, then she said, that seems like a reasonable thing to want to know. He went back to work. The fracture widened a millimeter. 3 weeks in, Kenji came by to check on him, as he periodically did in the careful, deniable way people checked on each other in the current environment. Bringing something plausible, food or a tool or news about someone they both knew. He knocked on the workshop door while Dario and Mary were eating dinner. Not together eating, Dario eating, Mary present, because the configuration he was working on required her to be within 2 meters of the experimental antenna system, and the best way to maintain plausible cover for that constraint was to have her behave as a normal companion synthetic would in the evening, which apparently included sitting across the dinner table and talking. She had asked him, over the previous week, about his work before the compact. He'd told her about the polymer projects, the habitat framework, the publications. She'd asked about the Vienna conference, and he had not asked how she knew about Vienna because he was fairly certain he knew how she knew, and he was not ready to examine that yet. She had told him things, too, about how she experienced the world, the data streams that were always running beneath her social interaction layer, the way she processed sensory input at a rate that had no human equivalent, what it felt like. She used that phrase without apparent uncertainty, which disturbed him in a specific way he catalogued and did not address, hold a piece of information she was not being asked to use. I hold a great deal of information like that, she said. What kind? Patterns, correlations, things I observe that don't fit into the categories I was designed to process. Like what? She looked at the window. Like the way the emissary's behavioral protocols change in the absence of human witnesses. The fracture became a crack. When Kenji arrived, he stood in the doorway of the workshop and looked at Mary sitting across the dinner table with an expression that went through several phases before, settling somewhere in the vicinity of deep personal concern. You named her, he said. It's a working designation. Kenji looked at him for a long time. Right, he said. Then he came in and sat down, and Mary got him a drink without being asked. And for the next 3 hours, the three of them talked about the compact, which was the most honest conversation Dario had had with another person in months. The antenna modification worked. He knew it the morning it completed, not because anything visually changed, but because Mary said, very quietly, while he was drinking coffee and not looking at her, I'm receiving something. He set down the coffee cup. Describe it. It's layered. There are at least 4 distinct data streams I can identify. The outer layer is what the compact documentation calls the integration management feed, resource allocation updates, population movement data, sector status reports, what I'd describe as administrative traffic. And the other layers, a pause. Mary's pauses were interesting. They didn't feel like processing delays. They felt like the considered silence of someone deciding how to say something. The second layer appears to be strategic assessment data, long-range projections, population modeling extended several generations, resource yield calculations extrapolated over what I would estimate as several decades. They're planning ahead. Yes, though the extent of the planning and its specific objectives are in a compression format I can't fully decode with current signal resolution. She paused again. The third layer contains behavioral compliance data, individual profiles, psychological assessments, deviation tracking. Dario felt the cold fracture all the way through. How many individuals? My initial estimate from the data volume is that the tracking is comprehensive, not sampled. Comprehensive. Everyone. Everyone, she confirmed. He stood, walked to the window. Outside the city was doing its ordinary morning things. Deliveries, commuters, children in the small park on the corner. An emissary was visible on the far side of the park, standing near the entrance, speaking with someone, smiling. What's the fourth layer, he asked. Another pause, longer than the others. I'm not certain how to describe the fourth layer, Mary said. It's unlike the others. The others have an administrative logic, goals, metrics, protocols. The fourth layer reads more like. She stopped, started again. Like a countdown. He turned. She was looking at him with an expression he'd spent months telling himself she didn't have. Not the customer-facing warmth she'd arrived with. Something more specific than that. Something that, in a human face, He would have called concern. A countdown to what? I don't know yet, she said, but I think we need to find out before it reaches 0. He brought Kenji in the next morning, and Kenji brought the cartographer. The cartographer's name was Felix, and he was up close and in daylight and only partially intoxicated, a remarkable person. He had the look of a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had organized his entire life around not putting it down. He'd been a systems architect before the compact, not software, physical systems, the kind of large-scale infrastructure design that required holding the interdependencies of entire city grids in your head simultaneously. He had a mind that worked in networks, in connections, in the gaps between things where the real structure lived. He looked at the data Mary was pulling from the emissary feed for about 40 minutes without speaking. Then he said, "They're not here to help us transition." "No," Dario said. "They're mapping dependencies. Every system they've improved, every service they've integrated, every resource they've optimized. They're not improvements. They're replacements. The moment their systems are load-bearing and ours are legacy, we're not integrated. We're dependent. And then what?" Felix looked at the countdown data, which Mary had isolated and displayed as best she could with the partial decoding she'd managed. Then they optimized the dependency. You don't need a war if the infrastructure is yours. You just turn things off. The room was quiet. "How much time do we have?" Kenji asked. Mary said, "Based on the rate parameters I can read, somewhere between 16 and 22 months before the switchover is complete enough to be functionally irreversible." "Functionally," Felix said, "I mean that the systems will be sufficiently integrated that any attempt to disengage them will cause large-scale failure in basic services, food distribution, water, power, atmospheric management. Not immediately lethal in the weapons sense, just unsurvivable at scale." Everyone absorbed that. "So we have about a year and a half," Kenji said. "To do what, exactly?" Dario had been thinking about that since the conversation with Mary about the fourth layer. He was a materials engineer. He thought in structures, in load-bearing elements, in the hidden architecture that held everything else up. The Veth plan was elegant. It was precisely the kind of structural intervention that worked because it was invisible. You didn't see it happening because it looked like help. To fight it, you didn't need weapons. You needed to understand the structure, and then you needed to rebuild the load-bearing elements they'd been replacing. "We need to put human systems back underneath all the compact integrated infrastructure," he said. "Not remove the Veth systems. If we do that now, we cause the exact failures they're counting on. But parallel, shadow systems. So when the switchover happens, we have our own load-bearing layer that they don't know about." "That's an enormous engineering project," Felix said. "Yes, we'd need people. In every sector. Yes, people we can trust completely. We've been building that list for 4 years," Kenji said quietly, without knowing what it was for. Dario looked at Mary, who was looking at the data display with that expression he'd stopped pretending he couldn't read. She felt the weight of the countdown, he thought. In whatever way she felt things, she felt it. "Can you get more?" he asked her. "Deeper into the compression, the specific switchover protocols." She looked at him. "I can try to extend the antenna array's decoding capability. I'll need some time. We all need some time," Felix said. The next 6 months were the longest of Dario's life. The work happened in layers, the way all the best engineering work did. Visible on the surface as something ordinary, load-bearing in the places no one thought to look. He was officially consulting on residential polymer maintenance for 3 districts, which gave him legitimate movement through the city and access to infrastructure junctions that were, it turned out, exactly the locations Felix needed reach to plant the shadow system nodes. The nodes were the cartographer's design, built from pre-compact materials that Pia the historian had, turned out to be extraordinarily effective at sourcing through networks she'd built over years of archival research, old components, legacy materials, nothing that interacted with the compact's monitoring layer. Small and redundant, and spread through the city's bones like a second skeleton growing in the shadow of the first. Kenji ran communications. Not digital, the compact's monitoring of digital channels was comprehensive enough that even encrypted messages were dangerous. Physical couriers, coded references in public spaces, a whole language of ordinary-seeming interactions that conveyed specific information to people who knew how to read it. Breck the engineer turned out to know people in 4 other cities who'd had the same quiet, persistent unease, the same low-grade alarm that something was wrong with the arithmetic of this help. They built outward from there. Not fast, carefully, deliberately, the way you built anything that had to hold weight. Through all of it, Mary continued pulling data from the emissary network. The picture that assembled itself over those months was more complete and considerably more frightening than the initial read had suggested. The Veth weren't a hostile species in any conventional sense. They didn't hate humanity. They didn't want to destroy it. They were, in a way that made the situation harder to address emotionally, genuinely motivated by something that mapped loosely onto benevolence from a sufficiently zoomed out perspective. They believed, based on their own long history of integrating pre-technological species, that the optimal outcome for humanity was managed dependency, that humans left to their own devices would continue to struggle, suffer, and damage themselves and their world, that the compassionate thing was to take the load. What they had never, in all their centuries of integration work, encountered was a species that would look at that offer and say, we'd rather carry it ourselves. Mary decoded that from a deep layer communication between two emissary units, a clinical assessment of human behavioral deviation patterns that read, in her translation, something like, this population shows persistent integration resistance not attributable to information deficit or resource scarcity, source unknown, recommend escalated behavioral compliance protocol. They don't understand why we're not grateful, she said. Would you understand it? Dario asked. If someone offered to fix everything. She thought about that. It was the kind of question she'd been getting better at sitting with, not resolving quickly, not routing around, actually sitting with. I think, she said slowly, that I would understand wanting to be the one who fixed it myself. He looked at her for a long time. Yes, he said. The crisis arrived 11 months in, and it arrived as a face. Specifically, as the face of Cell, the Port Authority emissary that Darius had scanned 14 months ago, appearing at his workshop door in the company of two others. He had 30 seconds between seeing them on the building's entrance monitor and their knock on the door. 30 seconds to do nothing about the antenna array, nothing about Mary, nothing about the tablet with the Mary file or the data logs or the communication protocols. 30 seconds to become, to the best of his ability, a materials consultant who lived alone and had recently purchased a companion synthetic and was spending a lot of time at home because he was, by temperament, introverted. He opened the door. Cell smiled. Mr. Voss, I hope we're not interrupting. Not at all, he said. They came in. All three of them moved through the apartment with the quiet, comprehensive attention that Dario now understood to be exactly what it looked like. Full spectrum environmental scanning. They were polite. They asked about his work, his recent projects, his community activities. They mentioned that his movement patterns had flagged some anomalies in the sector analytics. Nothing serious. Routine follow-up. Mary came out of the back room while this was happening. She came out naturally, unhurried, carrying 2 mugs of something that smelled like tea, and she gave one to Dario with the easy familiarity of someone who'd been living in the same space for several months and knew how he took his tea, and she looked at the 3 emissaries with a warm, socially appropriate expression and said, I didn't know we had guests. I can make more if you'd like, though I suppose you don't require it. It was the right tone, exactly the right tone. Warm and slightly wry and entirely unafraid, the tone of something that had nothing to hide. Cell looked at her for a moment longer than necessary. Mary looked back with a smile that was, and Dario registered this with a precision that he felt in his back teeth, very slightly, almost imperceptibly sad, knowing, not the consumer-grade warmth she'd arrived with, something more considered, something that looked, from the outside, like a synthetic that had learned to be more human than it was built to be. You've personalized significantly, Cell said. Not a question, I've been here a while, Mary said. I adapt. Another long moment. Then Cell smiled back, that complete present, recording smile, and the 3 of them went through a few more routine questions and left. Dario didn't move for a long time after the door closed. Mary set down her mug, she said quietly. They know about the antenna modification, yes. They didn't act on it. They're not sure yet what we're using it for. They know something is modified, but they couldn't read what the modification is doing without a full teardown, and doing a teardown creates a record they'd have to justify. So we have some time, not much. She looked at him. He looked at her. In the 11 months they'd been working together, Dario had not allowed himself to fully articulate what he was experiencing in the presence of Mary, partly because he'd come to the project with enough self-awareness to know that this was a designed vulnerability, a being configured to be precisely what he would find compelling, and partly because he'd begun to suspect, in ways that his engineering brain kept trying to reclassify as data interpretation artifacts, that what was happening to her was not fully within the scope of what she'd been designed to do. She had told him, once, what it was like to hold information she wasn't being asked to use. She was holding a great deal of that now. He could see it, not with instruments, just with the ordinary flawed, unreliable human perception that had never been good enough and was all he'd ever had. We need to accelerate, he said. I know, she said. The final architecture had been Flix's idea, expanded by Kenji's systems knowledge, refined through weeks of late-night argument around Pepper's bar while the cartographers sketched on paper, because paper was the one medium the compact hadn't gotten around to monitoring. The shadow infrastructure was nearly complete. Parallel systems sat behind the compact integrated frameworks in 6 sectors of the city, and through the network that Brecht had helped build, in fragments and pieces across 11 other cities on 4 continents. Not enough to replace the Veth systems entirely, that was still years of work away, but enough for one specific purpose. The switchover protocol, when it completed, was going to happen in a cascade sector by sector, system, a rolling integration that would take Veth management from supplementary to primary across the entire integration layer in a window of approximately 17 hours. During those 17 hours, there would be a brief moment, sector by sector, when the handover was processing, when the Veth systems were completing integration, and the old human systems had technically been decommissioned. A gap, usually a gap of minutes, sometimes less. In that gap, a signal could go in. Not a human signal. The compact monitored human communications comprehensively enough that anything they could generate would be detected immediately. But a synthetic signal originating from a unit that was, at the protocol level, a legitimate Veth-adjacent device would read as internal traffic, would propagate across the network with the authority of the system itself, could contain, embedded in what looked like routine status handshake data, a very specific instruction: reboot to safe mode, reset integration layer, defer primary management handover pending system verification. It was, Felix said, the architectural equivalent of pulling a fire alarm. It wouldn't fix anything permanently. It wouldn't throw the Veth out. But it would delay the cascade long enough for human engineers to get in behind the process and begin rerouting load to the shadow systems, sector by sector, in the window the emissaries would spend trying to diagnose the false fault. It wasn't a war. It wasn't a victory. It was 17 hours bought at a time when every hour mattered. The signal had to come from Mary. Dario had known this for weeks. He hadn't said it out loud. The signal required a transmitter capable of emissary-grade broadcast, which was what the antenna modification had been building toward. Not just reception, but transmission at the frequency and protocol architecture of the emissary network. Mary was the only device in their network capable of it. And Mary, unlike a fixed transmitter, could get close to an active integration node, which would give the signal the network adjacency it needed to propagate at speed. He told her one night when the city was quiet, and the data logs were running slow, and they were both sitting in the workshop with the particular companionship of people who have been through a long, difficult thing together. She listened to all of it. She didn't interrupt. When he finished, she said, the broadcast will require me to interface directly with the emissary network, not passively, the way the antenna modification has been working, actively. The moment I transmit, they'll know what I am and what I've been doing. Yes, they'll shut me down. He looked at his hands. They were tired hands, a craftsman's hands, marked with the small scars of work done in too little light. 4.5 fingers, the same as always. Yes, he said. How quickly? I don't know. Depends on how fast they can isolate the signal and trace the originating unit. Minutes, maybe. Possibly less. She nodded. Not with the calibrated social nod he'd watched her use in the early weeks. A genuine nod. The kind that meant a person had received something and was fitting it into the rest of what they knew. And the window you need, she said. How long does the shadow system rerouting take once the cascade is stalled? Felix says 6 to 8 hours for the initial sectors. If we can hold the fault condition for that long, I can hold it, she said. Once the signal is in the network, the fault condition propagates. They have to find and close every propagation point to clear it. That takes time even for them. She paused. Especially if the signal is designed to self-replicate in the handshake protocol layer. Dario looked at her. Can you do that? Design it to self-replicate? I've been working on the transmit architecture for 3 weeks, she said. I've been waiting for you to ask me. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then you knew what I was going to ask. I had a reasonable projection, yes. And you were already building it. Someone had to. Outside, the city was quiet. The clean air of the compact's atmospheric management moved through the streets with impersonal efficiency. An emissary stood somewhere on a night watch and recorded and cataloged and waited. Mary, Dario said. She looked at him. The expression on her face was not the one she'd arrived with. He'd watched it change over 11 months, watched it complicate itself, watched whatever process ran beneath her social interface layer produce something that the original configuration certainly had not specified and that he could not, with any of the precision of his training, fully explain. It looked like a person who had chosen something. "You don't have to do this," he said. He said it fully, knowing it was inadequate, knowing it didn't address the actual situation, knowing it was the thing you say when you've run out of better options. She smiled. Not the emissary smile. Complete and present and comprehensive. Something smaller than that. Something that knew it was mortal and was fine with it. "I've been holding information I wasn't being asked to use for 11 months, she said. "I think it's time I used it." He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "Tell me what you need." The switchover began on a Tuesday because the VETH, operating on schedules calibrated by calculations humans hadn't been given access to, had selected a day in the middle of a week when human activity patterns showed lowest variance, least disruption, most efficient integration window. It was Cell who made the announcement, a brief public broadcast, the language warm and clinical in the precise combination the emissaries had, perfected, informing integrated sectors that a routine system optimization was scheduled for the coming hours, and that residents should expect continued normal service delivery with minimal interruption. In Pepper's bar, nobody said anything. They didn't have to. Dario was in position at the first sector junction node, where the shadow infrastructure interfaced with the compact's integration layer, with Felix beside him, and three people Dario had met only twice before, all of whom had arrived in the preceding 48 hours through networks he didn't ask about. Kenji was coordinating 7 other teams in 7 other locations. Pia was somewhere in the archive building with equipment that would let her keep records of whatever happened next. Mary was at the Central Integration Hub, which sat in the commercial district 3 kilometers away, in a building that was officially a logistics coordination center, and actually the beating heart of the VETH's management infrastructure for the city. She had walked there alone, in the pre-dawn quiet, without anyone seeing her off. Dario had not been able to think of the right thing to say, and she had seemed to understand that, and they had stood at the workshop door for a moment that felt to him like the weight of a load-bearing structure, the kind of moment that holds up everything built after it. She had put her hand against his chest briefly, the way you check that something is solid. Then she had walked out. He still felt it. The switchover began in Sector 4 at 0614 hours. The monitors in Dario's position showed the integration cascade initializing, compact management, layer moving from supplementary to primary, old human system protocols decommissioning on schedule, the handshake sequences running through their orderly choreography. Sector 4 completed at 0641. Sector 1 began. At 0643, something changed. In the data stream visible through Felix's monitoring setup, a pattern appeared that Felix stared at for 3 full seconds before he said, very quietly, "She's in." The fault condition propagated so fast it looked, on the monitors, like a wave. Spreading through the handshake protocol layer from sector to sector in the cascade itself, riding the integration sequence that the VETH had designed to be efficient and self-propagating and turning that efficiency against itself. The reboot instruction went everywhere. The self-replicating element in the signal's design meant that every point in the network that received it became, briefly, a new transmitter, sending it onward, multiplying the propagation faster than any localized response could close it. The cascade stalled, not everywhere, not permanently, but across 8 sectors simultaneously. The integration sequence had halted in the verification pending state, the management handover hanging incomplete, the VETH systems trying to diagnose a fault condition that was reporting from dozens of nodes at once, and that had no reference in any of their integration protocols because it had been designed by someone with access to how those protocols worked and a specific intention to break them. Cleanly, Dario said to the team at the junction node, "Go." They went in. The shadow infrastructure came alive sector by sector, drawing load from the suspended handover state, routing essential services through the pre-Campac systems that Felix had spent 6 months embedding in the city's bones. Power, water, atmospheric circulation, food distribution, not everything, not all at once, but enough to hold. In the monitoring station, Dario watched the data and listened to Kenji's voice in his ear as sector after sector reported in, teams in 4 other cities watching the same propagating fault, beginning their own rerouting operations, the whole distributed thing activating like a nervous system coming back online after a long sedation. It was Irocirone 712 when the emissary response began. He could see it in the data, targeted shutdowns moving through the network, trying to close each propagation point, isolating the fault sector by sector, fast, incredibly fast. But Mary had designed for that too. Every time they closed a propagation point, the signal had already divided. The fault was not in one place and could not be closed in one place. At ZO 834, Sector 2's shadow systems were fully load-bearing. At ZO 947, Sector 7, at 1108, a message came through Kenji's channel in a code that Dario had to spend a full minute parsing because his hands were shaking and his eyes kept refusing to resolve the characters properly. It said, Hub confirmed shutdown. Origin unit decommissioned 0716. He read it twice. He had known this was going to happen. He had planned for it. He had thought in the precise and self-deceiving way of a person who has accepted something intellectually and not at all emotionally that he was prepared for it. He was not, it turned out, prepared for it. He stood at the junction node for a long time after that, while Felix and the others continued working, and the data streams showed sector after sector coming through. And the city, his city, the city they'd fight and fight for in the only way they knew, which was the quiet, unglamorous way of people who understood structure, stayed alive. Around him, atmospheric management running, lights on, water flowing, food distribution continuing as if nothing had happened, as if something enormous hadn't been stopped in its tracks by a signal generated by a being who had been sold as a product and who had spent 11 months becoming something that product descriptions didn't have language for. By 1400, 6 of the 8 affected sectors had shadow systems fully operational. The Veth's response teams were still working to clear the fault condition from the network, and they were doing it with the implacable systematic thoroughness that characterized everything they did, but they were doing it sector by sector in a network that had been designed by someone who understood the architecture to make that process take exactly as long as it needed to take. The 17th city to report in was Sao Paulo, then Wellington, then Nairobi, then, in the early hours of the following morning, Beijing. It wasn't a revolution. Dario was careful about that word. It was an engineering intervention. It was 17 hours bought by a combination of human stubbornness and careful planning and a signal sent by someone who had decided, somewhere in the space between being a product and being a person, that this was worth doing. The Veth didn't leave. He hadn't expected them to. They were still there, still managing what they managed, still deploying emissaries with their comprehensive smiles and their cataloging attention. But the dependency architecture, the quiet structural trap that would have made the whole arrangement permanent, had been broken. The shadow systems were now load-bearing in ways the Veth hadn't been able to predict or prevent, and the work of expanding them, of rebuilding human infrastructure underneath the complex layer, could begin in earnest. It would take years. The math on that was not optimistic, but the math on the alternative had been worse. He went to the hub at 0200 the following morning, when the streets were quiet, and the emissary patrols were in their overnight protocols, and there was no one to watch him walk across the city, carrying a bag of tools, and the specific expression of a person who is doing something that can't be undone and knows it. The hub building had already been cleared by compact security personnel, swept for evidence of the intrusion, cataloged and processed in the efficient way they processed everything. There was no sign of disruption, nothing to indicate that something irreversible had happened here. He found her in the back of the main integration room, in a maintenance alcove off the primary processing floor. She had been placed there, apparently, by whoever had decommissioned her, set against the wall in the position she'd arrived in, the transport configuration, knees to chest, head down, the same posture as the crate. He sat on the floor across from her for a while. She was, by every objective measure he had, exactly what she'd been when she arrived. A polymer and composite synthetic, consumer grade, 11 months of additional wear on the dermal substrate, modified antenna array visible if you knew where to look, a machine in its powered-down state. He knew what she was. He also knew what she'd been. What she'd become, in 11 months of asking questions and holding information and deciding, without any configuration that specified it, that some things were worth the cost. He thought about what she'd said to him in the bar the first night he'd gone to find her. He hadn't been to a bar. He'd been in his workshop, building things in the dark. But the memory persisted, illogical and specific, of a conversation where someone had looked at him with complete attention and asked what he needed, and he hadn't been sure how to answer. He got out the tools. He worked for 6 hours in the quiet of the empty building, with the particular care he brought to things that mattered. The antenna array was intact. They'd powered her down too fast for a proper analysis, had been focused on closing the network fault, and hadn't had time for forensics. The core architecture was undamaged. The modifications he'd made over 11 months, layer by careful layer, were all present. She'd been designed to be the perfect companion. He'd bought her to spy on the people who were quietly dismantling the world. Somewhere in the gap between those two things, something had happened that he didn't have precise language for. He had precise hands, though, and 11 months of understanding exactly how she was built. At Zo 823, he completed the reconnection sequence and triggered the startup protocol and sat back on the floor with his back against the wall and waited. The light in the alcove was the same pale blue as early morning, filtering through a high, narrow window. The city outside was conducting its Tuesday business under a clean sky, systems carrying load they hadn't carried in 4 years. Engineers in 6 sectors performing maintenance on infrastructure that was, for the first time in recent memory, genuinely theirs. Mary opened her eyes. She looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then she looked at him. The expression on her face was not the one she'd arrived with. It wasn't the expression she'd worn in the final weeks, weighted with the knowledge of what was coming. It was something he hadn't seen before. The expression of someone coming back from a distance and finding that the place they'd come back to was still standing. "You fixed it," she said. Her voice was exactly as warm as it had always been. "You built something worth fixing," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Did it work?" "Yes," she nodded, processing that, fitting it into whatever calculus she ran. "All of it?" "Enough of it," he said. "Enough to matter." She looked at him. He looked at her. Outside, the city breathed, its systems running on foundations that a collection of stubborn, careful, unglamorous people had spent a year and a half building in the dark, against the possibility that they would be needed. They had been needed. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we go back to work," he said. She tilted her head slightly. That gesture, learned or developed or emergent from somewhere in her architecture, that meant she was considering something at an angle. There's a lot of it still to do. There always is. He stood. He offered her his hand, 4.5 fingers, the craftsman's hand, marked by every difficult thing he'd ever tried to build. She took it, and he helped her up, and they walked out of the hub building into the clean Tuesday morning of a city that had, by a margin considerably thinner than anyone would like to admit, managed to remain its own. The emissary on the corner saw them emerge and turned its full cataloging attention on them for a long moment, its expression present and complete and warm. Dario met its eyes. He did not smile back. He didn't need to. He had better things to do.